Okay, so I'm going to be talking a bit further about timecode and applying a few theories to it and sort of giving a final summation of the case study. I'll be talking a lot about Lev Manovich's theories of new media and as they relate to timecode. One of his main sort of concept is to do with new media as aesthetics that accompany the early stages of all kinds of new media as they're sort of introduced to society. So rather than reserving the term new media to refer to sort of the cultural uses of computer and computer-based networks, communication, that sort of thing, some theorists such as Manovich suggest that every modern media and sort of digital communication technology goes through its own sort of new media stage, basically so that at some point every media form like telephone, photography, television would have at some stage gone through a new media phase. So rather than trying to identify what's unique about computers as like media creation, production, distribution and exhibition mediums, instead we should look for certain aesthetic techniques and characteristics that accompany every sort of introduction of new media. Basically looking at the new media stage of all media at some point. Manovich uses timecode as an example of these kind of aesthetics and techniques that seem to accompany the introduction of new media forms. In the mid-1990s, a lot of filmmakers started using inexpensive digital video cameras and created films more in a documentary style rather than the sort of cinematic conventions of the time. Instead of treating live action footage as raw material that could sort of be chopped and changed and put together however after in post-production, the emphasis shifted more onto the use of the actor's authenticity and getting a real performance from them, a more authentic performance. So yeah, the size of DV equipment meant that filmmakers could get a lot closer into the action and get a much more sort of intimate and immediate feel from their footage. The length of DV tape also gave them more freedom, the actors and the filmmakers, to improvise around a theme and sort of allow the events to flow more naturally, as opposed to the sort of tightly scripting each scene and doing short takes, which is sort of more in terms of conventional film. However, this aesthetic technique of representing real isn't unique to just digital video films. It's actually a predecessor of an international film movement which occurred around the 1950s, 60s, called cinema verite or cinema truth, which is in which basically directors opted for lighter, more mobile film equipment, which had sort of just been introduced around that time period, and they preferred to allow their actors a bit more free rein and to let events unfold more naturally. So both the cinema verite and the DV filmmakers used the new filmmaking technologies that had just sort of arrived at that time to subvert the established cinematic conventions, which I guess they saw as being too artificial. So we can think of timecode as an example of the new media stage of DV film, and in terms of metamedia also, which is sort of like a rearrangement of an existing media form and existing media concepts. Here we're talking about film, of course, but that's both in the style of the film and also in the visual layout with the four screens. So we'll also go on to sort of unpack timecode a bit more in terms of this idea of spectator editing, which is sort of the idea that by watching any given frame for a period of time, you end up with a different mental version of the film to the person sitting next to you, so that you sort of put together your own pieces of each narrative and make your own story and sort of edit your own version. So this calls for sort of like more of an active role on the behalf of the viewer in terms of creating meaning and basically creating your own narrative. It's sort of like, as we discussed in previous presentations, like a puzzle or a choose your own adventure sort of setup. It's a step more towards interactive cinema where the viewer can choose which story to follow, that sort of thing, and it brings to the attention of anyone studying it, I suppose, the relationship between the director and the viewer or responder, sort of in terms of Figgis giving the audience some control over what they receive from the film, the meaning they take away from it, although he does control this to a large degree with the audio, having the audio of whichever frame he deems to be most important louder at any point in time. But compared to more conventional films where you've basically just got the director giving the audience their film, and there's no sort of real way for the audience to respond or have any influence on that. It's just what they can take away from it. Just a few other concepts relating to timecode and to new media as a general topic. This is also from Manovich's theories. We've got new media as opposed to cyberculture, which Tanya will be discussing more in future. Cyberculture is sort of defined as the study of various social phenomena associated with the internet and other forms of new network communications. Examples include things like online communities, online multiplayer gaming, and also to do with issues of online identity and that sort of thing. The emphasis here is more on the social phenomena and doesn't directly deal with the actual cultural objects themselves enabled by the networking technologies. New media, on the other hand, is concerned more with the cultural objects themselves and the models and that sort of thing that are facilitated by all forms of computing, not just the networking. So basically, cyberculture is focused on the social aspect and the networking, and new media is focused on the actual cultural objects themselves and the computing side of things. However, as Tanya will be discussing later, there's a number of new sort of social phenomena which sort of cast aspersions on this theory that separates new media and cyberculture ultimately, and I think it's a bit sort of it's a bit dodgy to think about all those sort of media forms as either black or white, new media or cyberculture, so that'll be discussed a bit later on. In the language of new media, Manovich introduces this idea that new media are cultural objects which use digital computer technology for distribution and exhibition as like a defining feature of new media. So things like the internet, websites, computer multimedia, computer games, CD-ROMs, all those sort of things that use computers for production, distribution and exhibition are classed as new media. However, he then goes on to point out three sort of primary problems with this idea or this information model, which are basically, number one, that it's going to have to be revised every few years as more and more media forms that previously didn't use computers for distribution or creation or exhibition come to rely on using digital technology or computers for those purposes, so they'll then have to be added to the new media side of things. Number two, it's likely that eventually all forms of culture will use computer distribution in some way or another, and that will basically render the term new media like sort of will have no specificity. So that's another problem with that theory. And number three, that the definition doesn't really tell you anything about the possible effects of computer-based distribution on the aesthetics of those cultural artifacts. So basically, in other words, it doesn't deal with the question, do all forms of new media have something in common because they're distributed via computer? So basically, from all our research and study, it's become clear that defining exactly what is and what isn't new media it's basically a near impossible task, because the parameters and the definitions are continually changing, so it's almost impossible to keep abreast of those sort of things. Essentially, how you define new media depends on what type of classification or cultural model you're using, whether it's Lev Manovich's or Marshall McLuhan's or whoever else's you want to use. There are, however, a number of sort of key concepts, such as the idea that computers and digital communication technology are sort of the main means of distribution and exhibition. These sort of ideas we found are prominent in sort of most theories, and that's sort of how we've taken the path through new media. And that's my presentation.